Dear licensees, we are just days away from the early access launch of Prosperous Universe, and we thought this would be a great opportunity to give all of you a quick overview of where we stand, what we learned over the past few years, and what our short, mid, and long-term plans are for the project, but also for the company in general. We've been developing in this game more or less nonstop for the past 4 years, and over that time span, or rather, ever since we had the first closed alpha versions, we had more than 30,000 people sign up to the game. And obviously, not every one of these people has all the infos. Not everyone is following the development logs that we put out every week. So just to give you a quick recap or introduction of who we are and what Prosperous Universe is, let me just tell you that the idea of Prosperous Universe, the game, is really decades old. I basically had this idea 20 years ago already when I was working on another game, and really what I always envisioned was to have a real, true simulation sandbox with a closed loop economy, or a closed loop economic simulation. And obviously, for obvious reasons, this goal was not easily achievable. So this idea lay dormant for a very long time because kind of having that closed loop kind of stood in the way of actually making an accessible game, especially with the kind of know-how and experience that I had back then. So this idea had always lingered around but was never implemented. And then it was around 2016 or so. Michi, who you, if you are on Discord, know under the nickname of Molp, sat down over coffee and talked about different project ideas, and we wanted to work together on something. And we decided, hey, let's give it a go. Let's try this Prosperous Universe idea and make that into a game. And ever since then, we've been working on Prosperous Universe. We are completely self-funded, meaning all the cash that we require to develop the game, to run it, to operate it, to pay ourselves wages, obviously, comes from our existing title Airline Sim and a bunch of contract work that especially I am doing. Since 2020, we always also receive funding from the German Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure. It's quite a mouthful, and I'll get into a bit more detail about that in a minute. So just that should suffice as like a very quick intro about what Prosperous Universe is and who we are. So let's talk a little bit about early access and why we're doing it and why we're doing it now. If you are familiar with Prosperous Universe and have been following it for a while, then you know that the current alpha version, which is Alpha 7, has been running for a much longer time than we originally intended or anticipated. That shows us or tells us certain things. First of all, players seem to be enjoying the game. Like, we have players that have been active in this game world for 2 years. We seem to have a feature set that kind of that makes the game fun to play for people, also for a longer period of time. And obviously, we're very hesitant to actually kill off this game world that has developed over this rather long period of time. Again, we didn't anticipate it to run that long. Originally, when we started the alpha versions, we expected the game to relaunch every, I don't know, few weeks or month at most. So the fact that this alpha has been running for so long tells us that we're kind of on the right track with something. Also, this alpha version was running in what we call first access. So what was first access? When we made the game accessible to the general public, we were well aware of the fact that the game was very, very far from finished. And actually, it was so far from finished that we didn't want to risk calling it an early access just yet, because the expectations of people have been constantly rising for the past few years. And many people, when they see an early access title, they kind of expect the game to be basically finished. And as a matter of fact, many companies basically use early access as just an additional release. So it's pretty much a marketing tool to do early access. And just to be clear, we never intended to do that. For us, first access was a label to say, hey guys, this is pre-alpha version game stuff. It's not finished by any stretch, and there's a lot of development that still has to go into it, both in terms of gameplay, but also, of course, in terms of usability, stability, and whatnot. And every one of you who's been active for the past 2 years knows that there are the occasional performance issues. But we always said once first access means work in progress, and it means we don't have like a working core of the game finished yet. And that's just not the case anymore. We are pretty confident that the game as such, like the core that exists in Prosperous Universe, works. It works for a certain audience anyway. And we feel like it is time to kind of acknowledge that this is what the game will be like, generally speaking, and that warrants a move to early access. But I mean, on the other hand, there's of course the cold, harsh truth of us having to make money somehow. So obviously, we're also switching to early access because it also comes with a switch to a subscription-based model, at least for the Pro tier. You can always play the game for free, don't worry. But the Pro tier is basically going to be subscription-based. And not that we expect this kind of to take off overnight, and we making loads of money off of it, but we need to have the data, we need to have hard data and experience, and see, is this something that could work in the long run? Is there enough potential for Prosperous Universe to make enough money for us to sustain it in the long run? So, and this is kind of what early access will have to prove to us over the next months and years. So next up on my list of items today is, what did we take away from first access, or what did we learn over the past 2 years that the game was played by thousands of people? Maybe the most important bit is that because we initially tried to not make mistakes that we made with our previous title, Airline Sim, to be too simulation focused and kind of losing sight of the gameplay and fun aspect of the game, we just kind of tried a kind of game design driven approach to building the game without having a game designer on board. But let's get to that in a minute. And that meant that because the original vision of the game was very much based on a sandbox simulation kind of game, it kind of fell between two stools in some areas, especially if you think, for example, of your workforces or the center of global commerce, for example. These are kind of gameplay, game design driven features that kind of we and the player base kind of never really got too excited about. Let's put it this way. And another aspect that kind of became pretty clear pretty early on when we had more players in the game is that there is actually very little to pretty much no interest at all in a military component to the game. Especially any kind of direct military conflict does not seem to be appealing to our audience in any way. We always had military conflict of some sort on the roadmap simply because we wanted and needed a strong material sink in the game. But with military conflict fading out of the focus more and more over time, that also kind of changed our perception of what the game will look like, and our perspective on the roadmap and the vision of the game. Generally speaking, our impression is that our audience enjoys the sandbox characteristics of the game, and what they want to play is a kind of a simulation that allows them to play in a realish economy, meaning that they kind of expect, or our players kind of expect that the game world in Prosperous Universe works pretty much the same way as reality would. A capitalist reality, to be exact. And anything that kind of deviates from that, anything that comes across as artificial or game designy, that kind of causes a cognitive dissonance with many players. And if we get complaints about gameplay elements, it's usually about things like this. At the same time, what we also learned, of course, was that this find your own adventure kind of gameplay style that is a consequence of the sandbox simulation design is hard for many people. It's hard for many players. Many people struggle with finding their own goals in a game like this, even though they might find the general idea or the setting or the theme, or also our quite unique UI interesting and intriguing. It's still hard for them to kind of stay motivated for a longer time, because there aren't really any hard goals, and if you're not someone who just kind of enjoys the meta game or the role playing or the social interaction with other players, it's really hard for you to find out why am I playing this game. So this is definitely something that became clear over first access as well, and it's something that we will have to look into a bit more. And last but not least, there is this whole aspect of player agency that became apparent over the past 2 years. And by that, we basically mean that there are certain elements in the game that kind of contradict one of the core design ideas we had for Prosperous Universe early on, in that we said, if there is conflict in the game, you can opt to stay out of it, basically. Obviously, that was more geared towards military conflict, but of course it applies to other things as well. And if you widen, or if you look at this term player agency with a bit like a broader definition, then what it also kind of means is that people want to be in control over, for example, who they do business with, and what a contract should look like, and all these kinds of things. So that brings us to the next general item on the agenda, and that is okay. This is what we learned, but how are we going to how is that going to influence our immediate development roadmap? We are in early access now, and as I said before, or we're going to be in early access in a few days. And as I said, early access for us is an important step commercially, and to make it a commercial success, we depend very, very much on players, like on active players, obviously, and as a consequence of active players, obviously, paying players. So our main focus for the next, most likely around half a year or so, is going to be quality of life and onboarding. That's kind of the big cornerstones of our development roadmap for the next half year or so. We want to make it easier for new players to find their way into the game. We want to help them, for example, with a new interactive tutorial. Right now, you basically have to read up on how things work, or you have to watch our intro videos. But there's absolutely zero chance of a new player who's not really keen on learning the game find out just by playing around how the game works. You really have to read the manual, which is maybe not the best user experience, but a direct consequence of first access and alpha. But this is something that we're going to work on a lot. Part of that will also be kind of an overhauled company creation and starting location selection process, just to make it easier for people to make a quick decision early on how they want to start, where they want to start, without overloading them with too much information that they cannot really process at this time. Because if you're a new player coming into the game, you know nothing about the universe, you know nothing about the markets, you know nothing about what's going on, really. And we want to kind of make this easier for players to have a quick entry into the game. And then, of course, there's always Colic. You can always restart and have another go. Then part of that is also going to be better looking maps. I mean, this might sound a bit odd at this point, but we kind of, the maps are one of the few very visual features in the game. They're one of the few things that kind of communicate what the universe looks like, what the structure is, what lives where. And we really want to up the visual quality of those maps. We also want to add more functionality so that people actually have a reason to look at the maps and use them. And just to be perfectly honest, it's also, of course, something that just looks good, and also this makes it easier for us to market the game if we have something that doesn't look just like tables and numbers. Which maybe brings us to the next and very important item on our immediate development roadmap, and that is, of course, our mobile UI. Anyone who's been following us for a while and has read the devlogs knows that we've been working on a mobile UI for quite some time. This has been mostly limited to preliminary design work, user experience designs, the general color schemes and stuff like that. But the actual implementation work of this UI will pick up full steam, hopefully over the next few weeks, with the goal being that we have an early version to release sometime later this year. Obviously, as with all releases, this is subject to change, but that's kind of the general direction in which we are heading. Some of those things that we do for the mobile UI will most likely spill over into the desktop version as well. So there are things like the color scheme, and there are some features like the material transfer UI. These kind of things, they will very likely benefit from the mobile development even on desktop. Okay, and speaking of the mobile UI, that brings us back to the funding that I mentioned earlier. We received public funding from the German government early in 2020, or starting in 2020, for this exact project, for the mobile UI. And this allowed us to really do things that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, both in terms of resources, but also in terms of know-how, because there's just a lot of stuff that we don't know. And by having more money, we were able to hire new staff, to buy in know-how from the outside to kind of allow us to realize this. That said, some people have been worried about what this means for the company once the funding runs out, which is going to happen mid this year. And the most important thing I can say at this point is that don't worry, Prosperous Universe and Simulogix will live on. Like we always planned all of this with the end of the funding in mind, and we know that both the company and the game will survive without the funding. Nevertheless, of course, we will have to look into option to maintain a steady cash flow. Because to be perfectly honest, Prosperous Universe is not matching our expectations. So the revenue from Prosperous Universe is still, at least pre-early access, is still rather symbolic. And We believe in Prosperous Universe. We think it's going to eventually be able to make enough or generate enough revenue every month that we can justify working on it. But it still has to prove that. And until that happens, and we will continue working on that and make it happen. But until that happens, we kind of have to make sure that we're not going broke. And we are exploring different options for this. In part, we're looking, of course, into more contract work, for example. We're thinking about kind of giving more love to our existing other title, Airline Sim, which kind of has been, to be perfectly honest, and we're very sorry about this, but that's kind of the reality, has been neglected a little bit over the past few years, and it would really be about time to invest a bit more time into that to make sure that the revenue from that side does not dry up. And then last but not least, there are other options that I am not ready to discuss at this point because there are still important details to be worked out. But to make a long story short, rest assured that there is not much to worry about from a player's point of view. Prosperous Universe is going to go on, and it's just about how we manage the details, basically. So having said all that, that kind of brings us to the long-term vision of the game. So as I said, over the past few years, we learned a lot of things during first access, and we will continue to learn a lot of things during early access. But all this experience has very much informed our vision for the game, and it has changed. Some elements from the past are kind of less important or even disappeared, while others have become more important. And generally speaking, our plan is to go back to the roots in a sense. We want to get closer to this very original idea that existed long before Prosperous Universe did, in that we want to make it a simulation game, a sandbox, maybe not necessarily a closed economic loop, although by now we find that quite a helpful tool to evaluate certain things. But generally speaking, we will strengthen that aspect. We see the setting and the game world of Prosperous Universe to be one in which humanity drives out or goes out from the core worlds into the unknown, makes other parts or new parts of the universe habitable and exploitable for humanity. And this is kind of the setting within which our simulation is supposed to run, which again kind of implies a few things. So first of all, the simulation aspect means that some things that right now are not as simulation driven as they would have been in the original ideas will be more simulation driven. One example for this would, for example, be the populations and the workforces. And there we've been doing a few things into that direction with Populous, where we kind of introduced first aspects of population development, but we want to take this a lot further. We want to make it a bit more robust, and we want to make it more realistic in a sense. More on that is going to follow. I don't want to spill all the details, especially because they're not worked out just yet. But that's one of those examples where we kind of want to do more simulation and less game design, so to speak, which is, of course, kind of a lie. I mean, there's going to be a lot of game design in that. We will try to kind of cut down on game-imposed restrictions. We want to give people more freedom to use the game as a toolbox to play or to simulate an economy. That's kind of what people find intriguing and interesting about the game, and we want to strengthen that aspect. Giving them more freedom in what they can do, and how they, for example, deal with shared infrastructure. I mean, humanity venturing outwards is the theme, but how do we do that? It requires a lot of shared infrastructure, but we gathered from our experience over the past few years that there's different ways of sharing infrastructure, and the way that the game currently does it is not all that popular with our players, and it doesn't feel right in the overall vision for the game. So this is something that we're going to address. We're going to add more infrastructure, and we're going to totally change the way the infrastructure is managed. And one very important aspect to that, and something that really I think will tie a lot of things together that right now maybe look a bit like loose ends, is a completely new, much more structured and powerful political layer in the game. So we have some aspects of politics in the game, but these aspects were still very much informed from by our original plan to have military conflict in the game. And when we kind of started to move away from that, we were looking for alternatives to that. Kind of what could be a resource sink other than a military conflict, but that also gives players the kind of feeling of dominance, of kind of taking control of certain areas of the map or something like that. And the current political features that we have, like the admin center, they are the direct result of that. But going forward, we kind of want to bring the kind of politics that happen outside of the game in the role-playing layer, or in the what happens on Discord and on the forums, etc. We want to bring that more into the game. Kind of also detach corporations a bit from politics, but that's a whole different story. I don't want to go into details here as well. But that is kind of the idea of how we want to make the game more interesting. We kind of want to nurture this whole political role playing that's been going on, and we really want to give people the tools to really decide how they want to run their colonies, how infrastructure is shared, how it's operated, who pays how much for what, and all these kind of things should be a lot easier and better going forward. But I mean, that is just the tip of the iceberg. There's like literally a list of thousands of features. I think our fans come up with new great ideas every single day. There's more stuff that we can put in the game than we could ever finish. And obviously, we have to be careful not to add too much. But yeah, we're not running out of ideas anytime soon. That kind of brings me to my closing words. Just to reiterate that we are confident that Prosperous Universe has a prosperous future ahead of it, and it's just a matter of time for this core gameplay really to have settled in, to kind of the onboarding problems that have gone away, and we're confident that while Prosperous Universe will always remain a niche title, it is very much our expectation that within that niche, it's going to be a sustainable long-term game project that we will support for a long time to come. The main reason for this obviously is you guys, everyone who's ever bought a supporter pack, and thereby supported us financially, but also you guys in the broadest sense, like in the community sense. I've seen gaming communities from the inside and out, and I have to say that this group of people, the players of Prosperous Universe, must be one of the nicest, one of the most constructive groups of people to make a game for. And so it's really a joy to make this game for this kind of group of people. So we sincerely hope that we will be able to carry on this spirit even if the game grows. Like, I mean, obviously we hope the game to grow, and there's going to be the usual challenges that come with that, but I really hope that we're going to maintain this constructive, friendly, respectful climate that we have in this community. So that's basically the end of my address today. Maybe one last thing. Now with the launch of early access, and once kind of the initial chaos of the migration and the reset of the game world and everything has settled down a bit, the team and I will finally start to fulfill all the first access and early access tiers. So or perks. So if you have bought a pack in the past, or you're planning on buying one, please know that over the next half year or so, we will start actually fulfilling those tiers, and everyone will get their perks, including the physical ones. At least that's the plan. So once again, thanks a lot, and happy trading.